everybody in the venue, but also online. This is our penultimate seminar of the semester. We have one further seminar this Friday. Please check our website. It will be at the usual time of 4 p.m. But in the meantime, we're very pleased indeed to have Dr. Dean Dulai with us today, who's an assistant professor of political science at Singapore Management University, often known as SMU. His research centers on historical political economy and the political economy of development. He's done research on political dynasties, economic policy, long-run effects of the missionary state building, presumably referring to the Philippines there, yes, and how facilitation workshops improve local bureaucratic performance. Today, Dean is, in a sense, workshopping a new direction of his research. We're very keen to see that. His articles have been published in a number of top journals: Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, the Journal of Public Economics. Dean did his undergraduate in economics at the prestigious University of the Philippines, Diliman. He did an MSc in economics as well in Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, but then he saw the light, yeah, and did his
eventually
PhD
I did, yeah,
in political science at Duke University. So, and he's now a political scientist, has abandoned the field of economics,
right,
apparently. So anyway, we're very pleased to have you, Dean, and look forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I am very happy to be here. Let me make sure that, let's see, I can play this thing first and everyone can see it. So yeah, it's okay. Let's play from the beginning, right? Yeah.
Share screen.
Okay. Yeah. Share, yeah, so everyone can see, and then we can start the presentation. I just want to see if everything is working really well. Okay, all right. So yeah, thank you again, Mark, for the introduction. This is a very timely presentation for me. This is a paper that's now revised and resubmit at international organization, and it's the first time I'm presenting this version of the paper. So I'd love to get your feedback about it. All right, so I'm gonna be talking about narratives after empire, and like most of the things that I talk about or I research, my interest in colonial narratives began by just observing things that were going on in the world around me. So you can think about in 2020 and 2021, there seemed to be this reckoning for colonialism as people all over the world were trying to reorient their gaze towards the colonial past and think about what it actually means to be a subject of the former colonies. And we saw that in protests and movements around the world at that time. This picture over here is King Leopold's statue, the Belgian king, who oversaw the colonization of the Congo. You can see that it's been defaced, it's been vandalized. And this is very much the common story that we have about colonialism and what the response to colonialism should be, right? So colonialism did a lot of bad things. We all know that this is true. And our orientation toward the colonial past, especially in academic circles, should be one of, well, colonialism is bad and it should be treated as such, right? And that should be true all over the world. But I live in Singapore, as Mark mentioned. I'm a professor at SMU, and Singapore's relationship with its colonial past is very different from, I think, what we would commonly imagine. You can walk down the streets of Singapore, look at the Singapore River, and see the statue of Stamford Raffles, a British colonizer, right there in the center. So this is not a story of trying to forget about the past or highlight its malevolent and oppressive aspects, right? Somehow Raffles' statue is standing very clean, very proudly at the center of the city. What is going on here? There seems to be this divergence in colonial narratives globally. But this divergent narrative, it's not just a global phenomenon. I noticed this as well in the Philippines, where I come from and where I grew up. So we have some, Filipinos in the audience. We talk about Spanish colonialism when we were studying in high school and in college. And we really think about the revolutionary struggle for independence. This is a comic book version of No Limitangere, which is an anti-colonial Spanish novel that we all have to read at the university and in high school. And it really depicts the sort of oppression, the bondage that the Philippines had, right? And the negative parts of Spanish colonialism. It's evident from the picture itself. this here is not really about, so after being a Spanish colony, we're an American colony. And this is not really a photo of American colonialism in the early 1900s, but speaks very much the sentiment that we feel, or Filipinos seem to feel, about their former colonizers. When Obama came to the Philippines in 2014, you have this almost cultivating, or like, you had these things on Twitter that were like, Obama, please make us the 51st state or a US Commonwealth, almost a return to the colonial past, right? So even within my own country, we see these divergent narratives of how states project and people project and think about or recall past colonialism. And I thought that's very interesting. So this is my research question. What explains the divergent colonial narratives in these post-colonial states? What explains why we see something that seems so positive on the one hand and something that seems so negative on the other over an event that was very much well documented to be destructive, right? That's our understanding. Now, let me start first by giving you the higher level argument, right? I go into it, but here's the gist of the argument I want to make. We see these divergent colonial narratives because post-colonial leaders, those people who had political power after the independence of these post-colonial states, strategically constructed these colonial narratives in order to improve domestic political authority and build alliances in the international community. Meaning post-colonial leaders strategically constructed narratives to enhance and build their political power. Okay? That is the argument. Now, I feel like there is a bunch of literature in mainstream political science, but it doesn't exactly get at this question. So there's a lot of literature on nationalism studies and Anderson and all of the studies that follow. And at least to my reading, there seems to be a very straightforward connection between nationalism and colonialism. It's not just in Southeast Asia, but more generally. We think of nationalism in the post-colonial world as anti-colonialism, as the product of a struggle against a colonial past. So that makes it very confusing at the first instance why we see these very positive pro-colonial narratives in the first place. There's a lot of recent work, technical, quantitative work in historical political economy. And I feel like that doesn't really get to the answer either. A lot of these papers focus on causal identification of more easily measurable economic and political outcomes, right? Whether a country is more democratic, whether it's wealthier, whether the people are more educated, and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily interested in the variation in narratives and memory as the outcome per se. Okay? So these two literatures, I feel like, don't quite get at the kind of question I'm interested in. So what I do in this paper is to build on a toolkit from narrative international relations, Jennifer Mitson, Steele, Subotic, etc., to develop a theory of divergent colonial narrative. All right, so I'm going to be using the tools of narrative IR to do this. So what are my contributions? The first is to the first couple are to international relations itself. There's a lot of literature on diplomacy and soft power. So the presumption here is the states place great importance in projecting their image abroad, right? And utilize a lot of resources to do so. But in spite of that attempt to project and the resources given, we still seem to have these narratives that are stable over time. So what explains that, right? Number two, we think about the persistence of these colonial narratives despite the temporal shifts in the structural characteristics of the states themselves. So there's a lot of literature that says that, well, people tend to have more favorable opinions for more democratic states or richer states, but states become more or less democratic. Their growth fluctuates. Other characteristics of these places change over time, but these narratives tend to be very persistent. So why is this story the way that it is, right? And finally, I want to contribute to the study of colonialism and nationalism by creating a more complex link between the between colonialism and nationalism, meaning there can be anti-colonial narratives, but there can also be pro-colonial narratives. And that is very much a function of the agentic strategic decisions that people, the leaders, make after independence itself. So I want to complicate this puzzle, and I hope that I can do so a little bit in the paper. All right. So what is a narrative? Let's start there. A narrative is, to put it very simply, a story about the past. Because it's a story about the past, it's a story that can be told in different ways. A history is not just a set of facts. It's the way these facts are put together to emphasize certain things that need to be told. So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the Singapore story. The Singaporean government has a very clear story of Singapore, a narrative about Singapore that dovetails very clearly with colonialism. So the Singapore story, if you were to read the textbooks, is that Singapore used to be a sleepy fishing village. Not a lot was going on, as is depicted here, right? But that really changed in 1819 and onwards with the arrival of Stamford Raffles, the advent of British colonialism. What did the British do? The British imposed necessary planning and law and order. It turned a sleepy fishing village into a bustling entrepot, a trade port that eventually made Singapore rich. But the British weren't all great. They were also oppressive in some way. They were racist in some way. They were not perfect. They did a lot of good things, but they did some bad things too. But don't worry, because now the People's Action Party is in charge, the current ruling government of Singapore. And they are going to take the foundation that the British laid and improve upon that foundation to make Singapore exactly what it is, right? And this is the guy in charge, Lee Kuan Yew. He is the #1 catalyst for this change and this improvement, which makes Singapore rich, prosperous, democratic today. That's the Singapore story, right? As is told by the state. But because it's a narrative, it's not set in stone. There are alternative stories. What is one alternative story? Well, one alternative story is that Singapore is not necessarily a sleepy, empty fishing village. It had civilization, it had political order. Sang Nila Utama from the Srivijaya Empire was actually there many hundreds of centuries before the British came. And he was one of the people who established political order in what came to be known as Singapore, or Singapura, then Singapore. What the British actually did was impose a police state. The British colonial rule was very negative. It was racially segregated, it was oppressive, and it was authoritarian. Now, that British authoritarian state was used, or is being used now, by the current government. The current government is neo-colonial. It very much follows the template of British colonialism by preventing dissent, by preventing mobilization to happen, right? That's your alternative story of Singapore. So narratives are stories that can be told. You can tell a different story with the same history, so to speak. Okay? So who creates these narratives? In reality, there are scholars who study memory, scholars who study narrative, and we know that there are many players in the narrative game, right? Civil society plays a huge role in this. A good example of that is a lot of scholarship on Korea-Japan relations, where it is Korean civil society that's pushing against closer ties between Korea and Japan for reasons of the things that Japan did during the colonial period. So citizens, the public, civil society plays a role in constructing these narratives. Who else plays a role in these narratives? What can be called storytelling elites? The media, historians, academics, they all play a role as well in telling a history of a place, right? An example in the US case is the 1619 Project that tries to reorient American history in fundamental ways. Okay? So I don't claim that there's only one player in the narrative game. There are many players. But this paper focuses on the state and the leaders themselves and the narratives that they choose to construct. So I will be focusing on the leaders of the post-colonial states. For example, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Sukarno in Indonesia, Manuel Rojas in the Philippines, and look at the incentives and strategies that incentives they faced and strategies that they took, and why they constructed the narratives of colonialism that they did. Right? So let me define the terms first before I get to the more streamlined argument. These are ideal types. All right. So this is sort of a simplification, but I want to get at the essence of the argument by doing so. There are two kinds of narratives. The first narrative is an oppression narrative, and this is a narrative that we're very familiar with. So an oppression narrative is a story of malevolent colonialism, bad colonialism, emphasizing the violence, injustice, oppression that the native peoples faced under the colonial regime. The second narrative is what I call an empowerment narrative. So in this case, colonialism is constructed as a sort of enabling colonialism. It helped empower, build a foundation of political and economic order and progress for the native people and for these post-colonial states. And the story usually goes that that progress is built upon by post-colonial leaders. All right? So oppression narratives and empowerment narratives are two very distinct types of narratives that I will be looking at. If there are two types of narratives, there are also two types of leaders, meaning there are two different types of leaders who hold power after independence, all right? After the independence of a post-colonial state. The first type of leader I call a collaborative leader. Collaborative leaders are the individuals who work with the colonial government to bring about independence via usually a peaceful, but not necessarily smooth transition. And they were the ones who held power after independence, and they held power over formerly colonial institutions. They collaborated with the state, bringing about independence, and were in charge when the colonial state left. The other type of leaders are revolutionary leaders. These are quite self-evident, right? So these are individuals who mobilize against the state, usually through violent collective action. And once they were in power, they espoused rapid regime change and the quick transformation of colonial institutions. All right? Two types of narratives, two types of leaders. And the argument is very simple. Type of leader determines type of narrative. Revolutionary leaders construct oppression narratives. Collaborative leaders construct empowerment narratives. And both these leaders have similar objectives. They want to improve their political authority and they want to build their reputation in the international community. Similar incentives in general sense, vastly different contexts, leading to different kinds of narratives, okay? So the argument is highly stylized and simple. All right? Now, why are authority and reputation building the leaders' objectives? The leaders of newly independent states want to maintain political stability and they want political power. They want to maintain control, right? Authority, as I define it here, is legitimized power. These are the leaders now of the new nation state itself, right? And they need this authority. They need this legitimacy that allows them to pursue the policies that they want and enhances the odds of their regime survival, right? We know that authority/legitimacy generates compliance from the public over the leader's legitimate right to rule. And that was very important for these post-colonial leaders at the beginning of independence. So they want to improve their authority. Narratives legitimize them. Narratives improve their political authority. The second objective that these leaders had was to build their reputation in the international community. Reputation, as I define it here in a sort of international relations style definition, is the belief in the traits and the tendency of an actor, common to most observers. All right? So narratives in this case serve as signals to the international community that these leaders are going to run their state in a particular way. One example of this is that an empowerment narrative can signal openness to trade and openness to foreign investment. I'll show this in the Singapore case. So you have empowerment narratives of British colonialism to show that we're not going to shift towards the rising communist tide. Singapore is going to remain open to trade. Singapore is going to remain open to investment, and the use of the colonial narrative serves this purpose. All right? So these are the goals that leaders have when they construct the narratives that they do. Now, the other argument I want to make is that strategic constraints make the logic that I talk about here mutually exclusive. What do I mean? The takeaway is very simple. The type of narrative diverges very sharply based on the underlying context and incentives facing revolutionary or collaborative leaders. And that logic is very simple. Revolutionary leaders rose to power by replacing a colonial regime. Anti-colonialism is the source of their legitimacy. That's why people follow them. If they are anti-colonial in their rise to power and their mobilization against colonialism, then of course it just makes so much sense to build oppression narratives of colonialism once they are already in power, to support not only their regime survival, but also to support the rapid changes that they want to make in that society. On the other hand, collaborative leaders were in fact cultivated themselves, brought up by colonial institutions. So we can think about the Southeast Asian cases later. Lee Kuan Yew was educated at Cambridge. Many of the Philippine collaborative leaders were brought into a patronage system supported by American colonial officials. So they hold power, they were cultivated by the colonial regime, and moreover, they are now in charge of colonial institutions. The narratives legitimize, empowerment narratives legitimize both them and the formerly colonial institutions that they now rule. All right? Okay. And the last thing I want to say here is that type of leader is endogenous. I'm not saying the type of leader is random or anything like that. Whether you get collaborative leaders or revolutionary leaders is the product of many things and many factors that led up to independence itself, right? One factor is the characteristics of the colonial regime. So Goodwin's argument here is the more repressive the state is, the more likely revolution happens. Why? To use his words, revolution, a repressive regime leaves no other way out but revolution. So the probability, to put it technically, that a revolutionary leader holds power is of course a function of the actions of the colonial state itself prior to independence. It's also a function of collective action. Are these revolutionary movements, if they form, mobilized enough, organized enough to be able to supplant an existing regime? The more organized they would be, the more likely is that they can hold power after independence. It also dovetails with a lot of papers on colonizer identity and direct versus indirect rule. For example, indirect rule, they don't rule a country directly. Well, it's more likely that they're able to build up a native elite. And hence are more likely that the colonial regime is willing to hand over power to this native elite at the time of independence, right? So the point I want to make here is that type of leader depends on many things. I'm not saying it does not, but I think that the argument starting from type of leader gives a lot of explanatory power while maintaining a lot of parsimony. That's the point I want to make. Okay? Now, I'm going to engage in a theory building exercise, a comparative historical analysis of 4 cases across 3 Southeast Asian countries. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 of the 4 cases: the Philippines under Spain and the United States, and Singapore under the British. I'll start with a pairwise comparison, kind of like high level here, and go a bit more in depth in the Singapore case. All right. Now, why Southeast Asia and why these cases? The first reason is that Southeast Asia provides a huge amount of variation to be able to build this theory. Southeast Asia, so many of the Southeast Asian countries were colonized by all sorts of colonizers. The Americans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British, they were all in Southeast Asia. They all colonized. different countries or different places that became eventual post-colonial states, right? So there's huge amount of variation. But also the specific comparisons themselves, if you'd like to make pairwise comparisons, can address many of the inferential issues or external validity issues that we may have or that we may consider to be problems here, right? If I think about the Philippines, I do a Philippines, US, Spain comparison. It's the most similar case design. So I get within country variation. So within the same country with similar geography, similar culture, all of these things, you can get highly divergent colonial narratives, right? In the same place, you can have a different narrative of a different kind of colonizer. If I think about another comparison, for example, Singapore and Indonesia, it is what's called a diverse case. Singapore and Indonesia are very different countries. They vary greatly in terms of population, geography, ethnic composition, and what have you. But I want to show that the argument that I make holds for such different places, increasing the external validity of the case. And as someone who does Southeast Asia, I think it's quite relevant to do a Southeast Asia cases because there's so much classic work on Southeast Asian nationalism and Southeast Asian colonialism. And I feel like I want to bring that within the very mainstream comparative politics international relations space. This is why I want to do it. All right. So those are the cases. But what are the narratives? How do I operationalize whether a narrative is oppression or empowerment? Narratives are very hard to operationalize. You just can't count, right? So what I'm going to do is essentially best practice and follow the papers that have come before me in narrative international relations. I'm going to look at a bunch of different things. The first thing I will look at are executive statements and actions by post-independence leaders. That basically means speeches. The speeches that leaders make. Why speeches? And they make it in public? Because this is the time when they actually project that narrative to as wide an audience as possible, right? The second thing that I will look at, and the second element of colonial narratives of the state, is its institutionalization, its codification into laws, resolutions, and executive orders, right? And the third step, or third way I'll operationalize colonial narratives, is to look at state-sanctioned public accounts. What does the state project to the public in terms of what is in the textbook? What are in the newspapers that are supported by the state? What do they name the statues in the roads, right? These are all different ways, none of them perfect, but all different ways of getting at the underlying colonial narratives. Okay? Okay. So I'll talk about the Philippines, a pairwise study. What is interesting at the outset, when we think about the oppression narrative that the Philippines has towards Spain, and the empowerment narrative that the Philippines has towards the United States, is that these narratives are very non-obvious, actually. If we talk about, like, consider the scholars of the Philippines, and they talk about Spanish colonialism. Some scholars say that neglect, as much as oppression, was the name of the game for many centuries in Spanish colonialism. For over 200 years, the Philippines itself was not really taken seriously as a colony. It was mostly secular Spaniards in the capital city of Manila engaging in the galleon trade, and the friars, members of the Catholic religious orders, going into the periphery of the country to convert people to Catholicism, right? So it was not actually this highly oppressive colonial machine that took over the whole country and organized them into cheap labor. It was not that. And many of the nationalist sentiment and many of the things that we read about were really about the last few decades of Spanish colonialism. On the other hand, US colonialism with the Philippines began with the Philippine-American War, a very short but brutal war that killed so many Filipinos. Estimates are 500,000. Some estimates range up to 1 million. We don't know the real number, but the point is it's very, very violent. And why do I make this contrast? Because I want to show you that sometimes the facts of history don't account so cleanly with the narratives of history itself. If I told you just the story, then this was much more violent than this. And yet we think about the American narrative as so empowering. Okay? So why did it differ? It's because it was different leaders who told these stories. In the Philippine case, the Philippines gained independence through an armed and violent revolutionary movement, Katipunan, and they claimed independence in the First Republic in 1898, right? It was a short-lived republic, but it's a republic that was recognized and is recognized as the Philippines' first government, right? And it's the revolutionary leaders of the Katipunan, people like Emilio Aguinaldo, Andres Bonifacio, who led this charge. And it was Aguinaldo himself who became the first president of the Philippines. Revolutionary leaders running the country after independence. On the other hand, the transition to independence for America was very different. It was a cultivation process of native elites, where you had the Philippine Commonwealth in the 1930s and many of the major players on this. Here's this person called Sergio Osmeña, this person right here, beside Franklin Roosevelt, to show you the collaboration, right? The spirit of collaboration between America and the Philippines, Manuel L. Quezon, right? We're among the leaders at the very end of US colonialism. And this picture here is actually the day of independence of the Philippines. And this is the Philippine president at independence, Manuel Rojas, another collaborative leader, shaking hands with General MacArthur at the actual independence, right? So now we see that the nature, right? The nature of independence, who the leaders were vastly different in these two contexts. Revolutionary leaders in the Spanish case, or the Spanish colonialism case, and collaborative leaders in the American colonialism case. So, the argument goes that certain kinds of leaders construct certain kinds of narratives, and indeed they do. Emilio Aguinaldo, in a speech in 1898, this is wrong, sorry, it's a typo, right? He talks about Spanish colonialism, how much pain and bitterness do those past days of Spanish slavery bring to our minds, and how much hope and joy do the present moments of Philippine liberty awaken in us. A clear oppression narrative of Spanish colonialism by Aguinaldo, right? But what does Manuel Rojas say? This is literally the start of his speech at independence in 1946. The American flag has been lowered from the flagstaffs in this land, not in defeat, not in surrender, not by compulsion, but by the voluntary act of the sovereign American nation. The flag which was raised in conquest here has been hauled down with even greater glory. The American flag flies more triumphantly today than ever before in history. At the outset of independence, maintained over time vastly divergent narratives over two different colonial experiences in one country. When we think about the national heroes of the Philippines, it also shows you the narrative that they have. It's proof by omission. When we think about our national heroes, we think about people like Jose Rizal, right? The Ilustrado who wrote the anti-colonial novels, No Limit Tangere, El Filibusterismo. We talk about Andres Bonifacio. Some people talk about Aguinaldo, depends on what you think. But we don't talk about the people who fought against American colonialism. That's not really a big part of our story. So you think about the famous national heroes, and this is Ninoy, right? Ninoy Aquino, who was he opposed Marcos and was killed a few years before the EDSA Revolution. His wife became president of the Philippines. We talk about these heroes, we see a lot of anti-Spanish national heroes, but not a lot of anti-American heroes, right? When you talk about our independence, like when is the actual official Independence Day of the Philippines? June 12, 1898. June 12 is the date of independence from Spain. 120th Philippine Independence Day, which means 1898, as if 40 plus years of American colonialism never happened, right? It's proof by omission. And when you go and we read in high school, you know, my Filipino compatriots here would probably agree, right? We can read things like No Limit Tangere, El Filibusterismo, but we don't read very many anti-American colonial novels, right? That is true. So the last thing I want to say, let me just try to move ahead a bit faster. What do we see when we go around the Philippines, right? You see all the streets. I grew up on a street called Taft Avenue in Manila, and Taft Avenue was named after William Howard Taft, Governor General of the Philippines, and eventually became the US president, right? And so you have Taft Avenue, you have like Dewey Boulevard, all of these places named after former American colonialists, right? And so the commemoration through public accounts shows the relationship that the state has with the American colonial past or the US colonial past, right? Okay, so that's a quick and dirty comparison of the Philippine cases that I think just shows very clearly the divergent narratives as a product of or is correlated with that type of leader who is in power. Okay, so I'm going to do a more in-depth analysis of Singapore. So Singapore, to be clear, has an empowerment narrative towards British colonialism. Okay? And so Singapore's road to independence, yes, we have a little history, began after World War II. The common story is that when the British returned to Singapore after the war was over, they lost a lot of credibility among local Singaporeans. There was a great call for independence in the population, the end of colonialism. And that sentiment, that nationalist anti-colonial sentiment for independence, was given political life by the rise of homegrown political parties in Singapore, including the Malayan Democratic Union, the Labour Front, and in the 1950s, the People's Action Party itself, right? And in fact, the story of Singapore's internal self-government and eventual independence was one of collaboration between the British colonial regime and the local elites, right? There's a timeline here of elections. In 1948, Singapore's Legislative Council opened 6 seats for elections to natives. That was increased to 9 seats in 1951. In 1955, there was the formation of a legislative assembly and the election of a local chief minister, David Marshall, who's over here. In 1959, all 51 seats in the Legislative Assembly were open for elections. The People's Action Party, this is their sign, right? Won in very dominant fashion. Lee Kuan Yew becomes the first prime minister. The point I want to make here is that that decade leading up to independence saw an increasing collaboration, right? An increasing integration of local elites into the project of the colonial state. And there was clear collaboration most of the way, right? So how do I show that? Well, in fact, in the creation of the Constitution itself, that paved the way for the 1959 Constitution and eventual self-governance. There you go. Self-governance. We had a series of talks in London where many of the leaders of Singapore's political parties went to London to debate the specific terms of the Constitution itself. Lee Kuan Yew was there, members of the Labour Front were there, and while it was not perfect, I'm not saying that collaboration was perfect. There was a lot of conflict. In fact, David Marshall, the first chief minister, resigned because they were not able to come to terms with everything in these constitutional talks. Eventually, the second prime minister, Lim Hyo Hock, was able to iron out all the terms, pave the way for the 1959 election and the People's Action Party's rise to power. The point I want to make here, that while not always the smoothest, there was clear collaboration between native elites and the colonial government, leading to these native elite collaborative leaders holding power in independent Singapore. Okay? So one thing I want to say here is to cause a little bit of a tangent. I'm not claiming, while I say that strategy and legitimacy are major reasons why leaders choose the narratives that they do, ideology also matters, because ideological alignment facilitated collaboration in the first place. Okay? I'm not saying ideology doesn't matter. It facilitates collaboration. And there's a couple of quotes here that show that very clearly. Barr talks about the young Lee Kuan Yew regarding the British as his natural superiors, the benefactors of mankind. The British Empire was presented by its teachers as a natural vehicle for the progress of mankind, and the assumption of British superiority was explicit and all-pervasive. It's a bit of a dramatic sentence, right? But the point of that sentence was, well, Barr's point from my reading is he was to show that Lee Kuan Yew was very much someone who was born and raised into a British colonial view of the world, which made it easy for him to eventually work with the colonial regime and hold power after it. And Lee Kuan Yew says that himself. Many of in the 2004 speech to the British Chamber of Commerce, he says that many of Singapore's first generation leaders were educated in Britain, school textbooks on English literature, and the British Empire oriented them towards Britain, and they developed close relations with British leaders in both the Labour and Conservative parties, right? So ideological alignment, connections, I'm not saying they don't matter, they all allow for collaboration to happen, but collaboration is also and ultimately a function of the strategies that they choose to take to maintain their rule, okay? Now, empowerment narratives and the PAP, the People's Action Party's political authority and reputation building. The argument I want to make is simple here, right? The empowerment narrative in Singapore underscores the legitimacy of British colonial institutions because the PAP ultimately took control of these British colonial institutions. And moreover, the post-colonial state was able to build upon and better the colonial institutions that the British built up. That's the narrative. And that argument is actually an argument that is made by a lot of scholars of Singapore history. So Holden makes the claim that the empowerment narrative is simply this, right? When Raffles arrived in Singapore, it is seen not simply as a colonial occupation. It is seen as an imposition of certain forms of necessary modern rationality, town planning, good governance, or commitment to free trade. This is what the British brought to Singapore, that the post-colonial nation state would realize in the fullness of time. So the British brought it to Singapore. Its full and complete realization happened after, when the PAP built on these colonial institutions, right? That quote evinces a clear continuity between colonial and post-colonial institutions. The Singapore story itself paints that continuity between British colonialism and the PAP. Barr in particular, again, highlights two foundational narrative features of the Singapore story. What makes Singapore Singapore? The first is British colonial rule, and the second is the success of Chinese immigrants who eventually formed the leadership of the post-colonial state. He argues that these are the constitutive elements of Singapore's empowerment narrative. And they are told in this way to build the legitimacy and authority of the post-colonial state as the people now in charge of improving upon British colonial institutions. The empowerment narrative also serves to build reputation of Singapore. And in this particular case, reputation building that Singapore was capitalist, open for business in the post-colonial world, right? There's this story that people like to tell, or Lee Kuan Yew himself likes to tell, when he's asking for advice from Albert Winsemius, his economic advisor, on two conditions for Singapore to be economically successful. The first was to eliminate the communists, right? And the second was not to remove the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles. Why? In LKY's own words, investors wanted to see what the new socialist government in Singapore was going to do with the Raffles statue. Letting the statue remain would be a symbol of public acceptance of the legacy of the British and could have a positive effect. Signaling, showing, building that reputation that we are open for business, we're pro-capitalism, we're pro-trade. All right? And so those are the objectives, right? Those are the leader objectives that were faced. And in Singapore, it's very easy to see that it has an empowerment narrative. Lee Kuan Yew said this at the 150th anniversary of Singapore's founding. When Stamford Raffles came here 150 years ago, there was no organized human society in Singapore, unless a fishing village can be called a society. That narrative still continues into the present day. It's persistent and it does not change. Lee Hsien Loong in 2019, Singapore's bicentennial. 1819, by the way, the birth of modern Singapore is 1819, the year when Raffles landed. So modern Singapore starts when colonialism starts. And Lee Hsien Loong says Raffles set Singapore on a different trajectory, which brought us to where we are today. Because of Raffles, Singapore became a British colony, a free port, and a modern city. I mean, that's so clearly a narrative of empowerment, I think. Now, to be clear, the leaders of post-colonial Singapore understood that the narrative can't be so blunt. There has to be subtlety as well, right? You need to acknowledge that colonialism did bad things, right? The British did bad things when they were there. So Rajaratnam, the foreign minister of Singapore in 1983 said, true, Raffles was an imperialist, but he did not loot the country he was in charge of. His rule was not marked by terror and savagery. What lives on is his vision of Singapore as a great trading center, open to all who are enterprising and willing to take their chances on the basis of merit and hard work. So creating some nuance in the narrative while also tying the colonial narrative to Singapore's foundational narratives of meritocracy. All right? We see this in textbooks. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Both History of Modern Singapore and the Curriculum Development Institute of Singapore's textbook for teachers, how to teach education in Singapore, talk about the positive benefits of law and order in trade that the British brought to the country, right? And if you happen to have the chance to go to Singapore, it's just obvious when you look around. If you want to, take the train, you can maybe stop by Raffles Place. And, when you're hungry after all that traveling, you can go to the shopping mall, Raffles City, have something to eat. At night, you can stay at the luxurious Raffles Hotel, right? And, you end up staying longer. And you have family that grew up in Singapore. If they do really well, they can go to the Raffles Institution and the Raffles Junior College. Its name is not erased. It is, in fact, very much a symbol of luxury and quality of Singapore. You can go downtown and see the statue yourself. It still stands by the Singapore River, right? And what does it say? On this historic site, Sir Stamford Raffles first landed in Singapore on 28 January 1819, and with genius and perception changed the destiny of Singapore from an obscure fishing village to a great seaport and a modern metropolis. So that's your narrative. All right. So, oh my God. All right. So let me just conclude here. The argument that I wanted to make, let me summarize, is this. Post-colonial leaders strategically construct colonial narratives to gain and build their political power. Right? In the specific context of my paper, I make the argument that collaborative leaders build empowerment narratives, while revolutionary leaders construct oppression narratives. I did this through 4 cases in Southeast Asia to build a theory in this very historically significant region with as much external validity as I can, with pairwise comparisons that can deal with potential inferential critiques. And there are, in my opinion, many directions that this research can go. A couple that I want to mention here. The first is, what are the long-run effects of these narratives on public opinion? And this is the second part. It's a 2-part project for me. The second part of this agenda is to think about the effects of narratives on the public and actual public opinion over time. But also, I'm only talking about the state here. There are many players in the narrative game. So future research can bring in all these different actors in society and think about how narratives form, shift, change, or sustain themselves over time. All right, I'm finally done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wide-ranging, I think we can all agree on that, talk. And we have plenty of time for questions, comments, also for those online who can signal to Joyce, who's dealing with the online, if they would have questions. Not yet. Well, we'll get to you in a second, but if there are no questions.
Well, I can start with questions from anyone.
Yeah, sure. So while people are gathering their thoughts, I'll abuse my position as chair of this session. So the thing I take away from your talk is, we've got this, particularly in academia, we've got this very simplistic, anti-colonial, stereotypical narrative, and you showed just from these few cases in Southeast Asia, that's clearly wrong. But to drill down a little bit, there are three things that occurred to me during your talk based on the cases you cited, although other cases occurred too. The first is alternative narratives. So, maybe you're making a point about their narratives in major key, but they're also minor key narratives. Take the Philippines. You have the so-called Diliman, where University of Philippines students, you'll know the Diliman consensus idea. And the former Philippine president Duterte was an advocate of this, had a strong anti-US narrative. And we know that, okay, the official hero celebrations doesn't involve those who oppose the Americans, but certainly the Diliman consensus narrative does. So there is a strong countercurrent associated with progressive forces in the Philippines that's been there. It goes way back to the American period, but it keeps being resuscitated. So how do you deal with that? The second is, what about narratives that change? And you didn't talk about Indonesia, but perhaps you could comment on that. Did the narrative in Indonesia change quite considerably between Sukarno and Suharto? Suharto was clearly somebody, even though he was involved in the revolution and didn't deny the importance of the revolution, he was open for business. In that sense, fits your idea of a collaborative elite who is very much, trying to signal that Indonesia is no longer this fire-breathing revolutionary place as it was under Sukarno, but rather ready for business.
Right. And
you could also argue in Hong Kong, we've seen the change narrative, right? If it was originally a pro-British narrative, more recently we've seen, emphasis on the evils of British colonialism, the Opium Wars, and so on. So the narrative in Hong Kong seems to be changing. And the third question is, don't cases interact? You have collaboration, you had revolutionary elites against the Spanish, but there were also collaborative elites. Even Rizal, of course, was not a revolutionary. And didn't that set the stage for collaboration with the Americans? Because they were kind of waiting for something Spain could never give them, which was kind of preserving their interests and so on and so forth. Spanish colonialism got so bad, but basically that set the stage for, the collaborative, it's not just the Americans themselves and their clever policies of integrating elites. Elites were ready.
that's right.
They were willing and ready.
They were.
And what about Singapore and Indonesia? I mean, didn't Singapore contrast itself to the Indonesian case? We are not like Sukarno. We are not this fire-breathing, third way kind of place. We're ready for open for business, as you say, and we're ready for foreign investment and so on. And then, you can see them kind of posing as the alternative, and that in turn also strengthens the narrative, because you can contrast yourself to these other more, in this case of Indonesia under Sukarno, revolutionary case.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, it's all fantastic questions. So let me try to get at them one by one. So let me start first with this, like the overall sort of meta as to why I did the study the way that I did is that narratives they're very hard to study because there are multiple narratives, multiple players, and they happen simultaneously and contemporaneously, right? So for me, I'll get to each individual question, but for me, the first way to deal with this is to try to slice it in a way that is more simple and more understandable and more parsimonious, right? So that's the overall sort of mindset, I shall say, that I brought to thinking about this paper and making the argument that I did. Now, let's go kind of one by one through the comments that you made. So, in reality, every case has collaborative and revolutionary leaders. That's always true, right? In the Philippine case, that was 100% true. Many of the former revolutionary leaders, in fact, became collaborative, and they shifted over time, right? So I'm not saying that there were only one kind of leader. The key here is who held the reins of state power after independence. That's the key. So I'm not saying that and by saying that, I'm also implying that these are the people who have the power to shape the narrative from the perspective of the powers of the state to project this forward, right? So while there were revolutionary leaders revolutionaries during the American colonial period who controlled the Philippine government at independence in 1946, and thus who was able to project these narratives through the regular and normal powers of the state. It was the people who collaborated with the American colonial regime. So I'm not saying that revolutionary leaders they were not there, they were there and they had their own narratives, but they didn't have the state apparatus that they needed to project those narratives forward. And which speaks to the first point. Let me get to the first point. There are alternative narratives, and there continue to be alternative narratives. Academia itself has many alternative narratives that contrast and juxtapose with state narratives, and it can be very, very different, right? So those alternative narratives, they play a role. But implicitly, I will say that in my argument, I focus on state narratives because these state narratives tend to be the most dominant, they tend to affect public opinion the most, and they tend to matter the most if we're being real about it, right? And I can show that in the second paper in public opinion. State narratives have a strong effect on the general public's perception of the narrative itself. We can have alternative narratives in academia, but they're really not that influential in the general public, right? That's just the truth. The state has the power to create narratives, project them, and teach to people, right? Not everyone's interested in politics and alternative narratives. Although it can change. Now, and then that's to your other point, Mark, the narratives can and do change over time, right? And I did talk in the presentation about the different players in the narrative game, civil society, these storytelling elites. But with the case of, so there are instances when narratives change. Implicit in my argument is that it's not that easy to change the narrative. I never said that explicitly, but state narratives tend to be persistent, but not always. So what is the condition under which these narratives can change? And to me, the most obvious condition is a very clear and sharp regime change and structural change. Because by eliminating the existing regime, if you have an alternative regime that has the capacity to create a different set of institutions, then you can create a different set of narratives. But the regular year-to-year of politics does not afford your typical politician the opportunity to foundationally change this narrative. So I think that that's just obvious from the point of view. And even when they do, they just revert back to normal. Whatever people want to say about Duterte and his, for a time, like explicit anti-US stances, public opinion eventually whiplashed back to its status quo. And the sort of like how US colonialism is being projected didn't actually change very much at all. So while you have these sort of challenges to it, it takes something much more structural to fundamentally change this narrative, especially because they've been narratives for a long time. It's not that easy to change something that it's kind of embedded in the world around you, in your constitution, in your rules and laws, without facing backlash. And most politicians just don't want to do it. I just don't think they would be willing to put in the effort, even if they wanted to. So that's what I think.
Related to Mark's point as well. Might be interesting to test your theory on Vietnam, for instance.
Yeah.
Because even focusing just on state narrative, right?
Right.
Obviously, the Communist Party of Vietnam.
Yes.
Yes. Anti-colonial struggle and its source of legitimacy remains that its history of leading the population victory.
Yes.
But the narrative there today, right? Even just focusing on state narrative, it's a mix, right? You have state-sanctioned narratives in the history textbooks, public museums. They're still very full of the oppression narrative, right?
Yeah.
But look at public speeches, look at laws and policies. It's much more collaborative, right?
Right.
So even on the part of the state, there's that mixture,
Yes.
right? And it might be because maybe it's a transition. Maybe that hybrid situation maybe is what we're witnessing is a transition, right?
Yes.
That could be possible, but
yes.
I don't know. That's why I think it might be good to test your theory on Vietnam.
Yes, so yeah, thank you. I think it's a really great point. I didn't include so this is Vietnam, the aftermath of the Vietnam War, right? And that's what you're referring to, right? And the Vietnamese Communist Party and all that. Well, I didn't include it in the first case because I mean, I wouldn't call it a colonial, the American War. I don't call that a colonial enterprise per se. I mean, it'll cause a lot of like debate about it. So I decided not to just not deal with that. Now, I will say that you can make it bigger. It's not just about colonial narratives, it's about imperial narratives. If it's about imperialism, then I think there's a broader umbrella by which we can examine the Vietnam case. Because I agree that the Vietnam case is a case worth studying, right? Now, just to say, why I chose these cases, because they were most illustrative of building the theory, right? Like that is one reason. Singapore is a clear case to me. The Philippines, clear case. Indonesia, a clear case. The Vietnam case is a little bit muddled and introduces greater complexity into the argument that I'm trying to make. Where now you have some of the indicators of narratives lean one way, while other indicators lead the other way. And I just want to say two things about that without having a great answer to what exactly is going on here, right? I think it says a couple of things. Number one, to be able to change, number one, I think it underscores the overarching point that there might still, narratives are strategic. And if they change over time, they may change for strategic reasons, including the shifting relationship between the US and Vietnam over time. And those narratives can change to accommodate that. But related to that, I think that narratives can change maybe even slowly and not as quickly as the Cardinal Suharto, if you have a regime with the power and the capacity to change those narratives. Because the Vietnamese, in my opinion, the Vietnamese Communist Party, it has very high capacity and ability to do so. But why they change some things and not things totally? That's a great question. I don't have a great answer to that, but that's something that would definitely add nuance to the extended argument. Just to say, I'm actually I want to turn this thing into a book actually. And I do want to include the Vietnam case because I think it's just, number one, historically super relevant. If you're not a Southeast Asia specialist, you know the Vietnam War. And I think it introduces particular complexities that you mentioned that need to be grappled with and strengthen the overall push if done well, right? But I don't have a great answer to exactly why you see those particular differences. But thanks for the question. Yes, Claudia.
I have many questions.
Okay,
Some
okay.
of which Mark has already asked. So I guess first I was wondering, perhaps the continuity of the narratives speaks more to the lack of regime change, like in places like Singapore. I think you kind of answered that question, Mark. And I was curious about cases where some revolutionary leaders kind of coexist with collaborative leaders, or one leader kind of embodies both features of a revolutionary leaders and collaborative leader. And I was thinking in particular about, of course, the South Korean case of, well, his name is Man, but I guess his name is written in this weird English language way.
Okay.
Syngman Rhee.
Right.
Syngman,
Right.
I would say. And I feel like he's an interesting case because he was definitely a freedom fighter, like independence fighter, and he was super anti-Japanese. But at the same time, he was, pro-US to a degree, to an extent where he practically begged the US to like establish this alliance relationship with South Korea. I actually have an article on this particular episode in history, actually. So I feel like he is someone who has both elements, although of course with different colonial and imperial powers. And also, speaking of Japan, I was wondering, although, Japan didn't really colonize these countries, but all these countries that you seem to look at in your article have a period of Japanese occupation. And I was wondering if we switch Japan with, Spanish and the Americans, the Philippines, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the British in Singapore, would we see like similar dynamics there? And also, sorry. And also, I was also wondering, like, present day political motivations and interests, would that determine these narratives more so than, your central argument? Like, could we also say that the present day political security positioning and interests of these post-colonial states also shape the endurance or the lack of endurance of certain narratives of these states? And lastly, I'm sorry, because you're studying a bunch of cases, and of course you're from the Philippines and you live in Singapore. I'm just curious, if you study like Indonesia, and also you talked about studying Vietnam, I'm curious, like, would you look at original language sources, or would you like rely mostly on like English language sources? I'm just curious as someone who wants to, look at different countries.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So let me, these are a lot of good questions, I will say. Let me start with the end. Like, I use English language sources. I think that's I'll be straight to that. But like in Singapore, in a way, the particular case helps me because so much of Singapore's academic literature is already in English, and so much of the Philippines academic literature is also. I mean, it can be in Filipino, it wouldn't really matter to me. But like, if in a general sense, so I guess I'll make a bigger point here. Like, I don't see myself as a historian. I don't. I'm not, right? I'm a comparative historical political scientist in the case of this. And I see my role in particular as not going into the archives and really like digging for this new, although that'd be great. And I can do that, that enhances the paper. But I see my role as someone who uses what historians have and tries to build arguments around that is consonant with political science. That's what I feel like my role is. I can't do what the historians do. Like, I let them do that. I mean, I can't do that. I rely on them. I build on them, Is that a perfect way of doing things? It's just academic specialization, in my opinion. Now, in terms of Manri, right? It's a little hard for me to say because I just don't know him well, so I can't really make a very intelligent comment on it. I think our knowledge of him is greatly asymmetric. But I will say that we certain leaders can have different perceptions of certain colonial powers, right? So I think that just from what I understand from what you said, Claudia, it's like, I don't think necessarily that we had this kind of X relationship with the Japanese and Y relationship with the Americans. It doesn't necessarily, it's not, the argument is almost like it pairs a leader with a certain colonial power. So I'm revolutionary towards power A and maybe collaborative with power B, right? I can think differently about different colonial regimes. So there are different colonial regimes. Now with Japan, so Japan, it looms very large in this story, right? And in fact, there's going to be a Cambridge Elements, I think, of Southeast Asia by Diana Kim, that talks about Japanese colonialism and really trying to think about that very carefully. And so, but why do I focus in these cases on the Western colonial powers, right? Because ultimately, it was the Western colonial powers that transitioned them into independence. So after the Japanese, the British still returned to Singapore, and they were there for over a decade after the end of the war, and they rebuilt institutions. And it was against that returned British colonialism that independence was eventually gained, right? In the Philippine case as well, we talked about Japan. The Japanese, were in the Philippines 1942 to 1945, but independence of the Philippines was between the Philippines and the United States. So it was that particular moment of independence. It was not the Japanese, it was the Western powers themselves after the war. Right now, what I will say is that the Japanese created certain political alignments and conflicts in these different places that fed into these kinds of dynamics. Ultimately, it was the Western powers that these leaders were working with or working against at the end of the war, right? Let's see, what else okay, so can narratives change based on contemporary politics? So I get them, I have to be consistent with what I've been saying, and my answer would be no. Like generally no. So colonial narratives tend to be very stable over time. So what's actually changing is not the colonial narrative itself, but the contemporary relations and contemporary narratives between these two places. So the colonial narrative is different. And that narrative is hard to change because it's so constant. Why? Because it's tied into the founding of the nation itself. So my implicit argument here, if I want to make a stronger claim, is that to fundamentally change the colonial narrative is to change in some ways the stories of these nations. It changes what you study in high school. It changes how you look at the past, right? But narratives that serve the present, they can exist and they can be different. But colonial narratives, I think they're very hard to change. They can change. It is a really big shift, right? A big, almost like traumatic structural discontinuity, shall we say, in what's going on. So that's what I say to that. I can, yeah, but yeah. Anyway, I think that's your questions.
Chris, are there any online questions?
Yeah, there's a question.
Yes.
from Zoom.
Yes.
So post-colonial leaders construct narratives around colonialism that aim to benefit their own legitimacy. So whether as collaborators or as revolutionaries, but is there a more objective way to measure the bad and good of colonialism in a Southeast Asian context? Or is the colonialism always in the eye of the opposer?
Colonialism is, thank you for the question. It is a good question. So will I say that, can you say that colonialism is bad and good? I would say that this story complicates that simple. Good colonialism leads to collaboration and bad colonialism leads to revolution. I'm not saying that the colonial state did not matter. I'm not saying that the actions of the state itself did not affect the leaders that were there. But a simple story of good and bad colonialism, a simple story of colonizer identity is not sufficient or does not adequately explain the divergence that we have here. And I think this example shows that, which is, I think I look right here, right? That's the Zoom, right? Right here. So I think what I want to say with this slide is that if you think about Spanish colonialism and US colonialism, which was what US colonialism really good, it was super violent, right? And you can make a case, maybe a contrarian case, but a case nonetheless, that if you think about violence as really, really bad, then US colonialism is really, really bad in a way the Spanish colonialism was not. But the narratives about them are so divergent. So I think that's number one. But it's also not always in the eye of the beholder, right? And there's two ways to answer that. The simple way to answer that is these things, they're narratives, but these things actually happen. Things actually happen. But the other way to answer this is you just can't fully make up a narrative, right? Narratives in some way are still bound by a certain reality. But the question is not about the eye of the beholder, but whose eyes and whose story? Who is telling that story? And the argument I make is that some people have a capacity to tell that story in ways that shape the hegemonic or dominant narrative. And those are the leaders themselves. So anyone can have their own narrative, they can have their own story. But certain people have a outside influence over what nations tell themselves is their story. That's what I wanted to say. As a way to answer that question.
If I can, I'd like to follow up on Claudia's point about Japanese period. So if you think about the as you're calling it, the pro-US state narrative, post-colonialism, that has a lot to do with the Japanese period. I mean, American colonialism, one tends to forget this because we read history backwards, remained controversial, even though people were collaborating, remained very controversial. The Philippine press was very critical of the US. There were all sorts of scandals where there was McCoy does a good job in his police book, for example, showing all the scandals, all the conflict between Colonial and supposed collaborators like Kazan and Osmania.
Yeah.
And then the Japanese come in, and of course you have some of these anti-American nationalists like Ricarte who get discredited because they're collaborating with the Japanese. So that's one side. Some of the pro-revolutionary elites get discredited. And on the other hand, you know, other elites who had collaborated with the Japanese are a little worried about how the Americans are going to treat them.
Mhm.
So they better get on side with the Americans
Yeah.
so that they will get forgiven, quote unquote, for that. So, I mean, it seems to me that really shapes the character of this pro-US narrative. And I think that that's one problem in Philippine historiography is that that's left out. People can't understand why all of a sudden after this violence and terror and you know, controversies about the American period, that all of a sudden there's this pro-US narrative. And because the violence of the Japanese period, particularly at the end, was so intense, and there was a popular insurgency, the Huck insurgency against the Japanese, and all these kind of things, that this anti-Japanese sentiment was very important in providing the context for this pro-American side.
Yeah, I agree. To put it really simply, I agree. And you know, like, okay, so I think that there is one of the challenges of doing narratives is that you can always go deeper. You can always add that's the inherent challenge of this thing. What about the Japanese? What about, right? That's always going to be the case. What about this other player? So there's no doubt. I mean, I totally agree, Mark, that served us. I mean, this is also the argument that people make about Japanese narratives in Taiwan, because after the Japanese had the KMT, and of course what the KMT did sort of like reflexively shaped how people saw Japanese colonialism, for example. So there's all of these things that go into the narrative, right? They're deep. And so I'm not saying that like it didn't matter, but I guess I want to say, what's the main takeaway that I want? So what I want to say is that at the end of the day, these narratives are shaped by a variety of complex factors. I also don't want to say that the American narrative was so smooth, right? Like that's not what I'm saying. That like Quezon and Osmeña were always super, super good with the US. They never had any complaints, all of these things. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to remove that complexity. But at the end of the day, who were the people who held power? And that's what I'm trying to say. Like, there's all of these things that happen, but I think you can get 80% of the way there by thinking, who actually held power and what are the means by which they held power at independence? Did they hold power by collaborating with the US? Regardless of what they did during the war, they're sorry, we'll work with you, all of that. And they collaborated with the US at the moment of independence. They now hold the power. And they now face incentives, of course, to build a narrative of empowerment that supports the US colonial institution that they now rule. And that kind of makes sense to me. I would think about my own, let's say I was anti-US, right? In the Japanese time. And I was like pro-Japan. The US comes back and I'm like, oh no, I'm very, very sorry. I'm gonna work with you. I know we're gonna do this. And then a few years later, I hold power and I collaborate with them. And of course, now I hold the US institutions, which is what happened at the moment of independence. So I'm still going to construct these empowerment narratives nonetheless. So I think the challenge though is like how to tell this story while giving the appropriate time and space for the complexities of these kinds of things that are really there. And you know, my last thing for trying to answer this question is I think that the paper itself is just not enough words. 14,000 words doesn't capture all of these complexities. That's why I want to make it a bookmark. Like, because I think all of these things are really important. And this is just a hyper stylized. I guess it's true. It's a hyper stylized argument, right? But I feel like when I write the book, I have a lot of space to address all of these things. I think it's a book project, and not just a paper. But I don't disagree with anything you said. Yeah.
We have time. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Since I'm also thinking about doing a book project.
Oh, really?
Although I'm not very far along. I'm just beginning to think about
Oh, I'm also not far along. Haven't written a
But
single word.
this is like way farther along. But so I'm trying to focus on like victims and
Mhm.
victim groups,
Yeah.
and victimhood, I guess. And I'm just curious, when you think about South Korea, you immediately think of certain victim groups like the comfort women.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if, in your cases, Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore, do you have any like representative symbols of like victimhood in terms of the colonial period? Because I can only think of like the Japanese victims of Japanese occupation and not like the victims of the Dutch
Yeah.
colonized, whatever. So
Yeah.
I'm
This is
curious.
this is a really interesting question, and
Yeah.
I guess I would say like I off the top of my head, because what this is in my, I guess, my understanding in the Korean case is these are regular people, right? That these comfort women, they're not the elites. They were Koreans who these bad things were done to them, but they were given an identity. That identity is very clear that they were comfort women. And you know, off the top of my head, I just don't see that analog in the Southeast Asian, and perhaps like Mark would know and correct me, or you know anyone else would know and correct me, but it's not that obvious what that would be. If there's anything, so empowerment, there's none, right? I mean, there's a positive story of colonialism. So there are no negative identity groups here. But just thinking about, let's say, the Spanish case, if there's any victim group, it's not like the farmers or these or that people that's given so much salience, right? It's like it's so salient in contemporary recollections or collective memory in Korea. If it's anything, it's just the elites themselves, Gomburza in the Philippines, or the priests, the Catholic Church priests. You know, they were executed. Rizal himself, this national hero guy, he was also executed. But these are people, right? They're people that were elevated as part of the larger story. But this comfort women, they're not individuals with names, they're a group. And I don't see any analog in that. But also there was the death march, right? In Japan, Bataan death march. Yeah. So that was, but those are soldiers, if I'm not mistaken. So that's the closest that I can, all these like I think American, Filipino soldiers, and they were doing this march, and a bunch of people died.
But commemorated together between the Americans and the Filipinos, so that enhances the pro-US narrative.
So but that's the closest that I can get to a certain group,
Yeah.
a certain group
Yeah.
of people that's victimized.
Yes.
But it's not comfort women, you know, like because comfort women, they have their statues and everything, right? So the Korean case for me is very unique. I actually think it's very unique, and I think it's not about victimhood, but I'll tell you the argument of my second follow-up paper. Why did I do Korea, or why did Jeong and I do Korea? It's because Korea's narrative, national narrative, is a narrative that I think make these colonial narratives very salient over time. Because many places, their colonial narratives are there, but it's not like you hate. I don't think Filipinos hate the Spanish today, for example, but it's very negative public opinion towards Japan among South Koreans, right? And the argument that Jeong and I make in the paper is that Koreans had a particular narrative, which we call the restoration narrative. So the idea is that something was lost and destroyed through Japanese colonialism, right? The Korean monarchy essentially it ended under the Japanese. And the story of Korea was about reclaiming something that was lost, reclaiming the old nation. That's very much right. I mean, if I'm correct, it's very much imbued within the sense of national identity of being Korean. In the Philippines, that's not the case, especially with America. I mean, we don't even, like, you just look at when our Independence Day was, right? There's continuity between the colonial and post-colonial. In the Indonesia case, it's not like there was something lost. It's that something was found. That sense of national identity was found at the end of the last decades of Dutch colonialism, and the Indonesian nation was born. So the way that story was told, it was not that the Indonesian nation was taken away by the Dutch, but it was now formed at the end of colonialism. So I think that Korean case is unique because of this particular restoration narrative and that sense of loss that was felt by colonialism. I think that's what, yeah, anyway, try to write the paper, I'll send it to you, see if you agree.
So we've reached the end of our time, and if there are no further questions online or among the audience here, all that remains is to thank you once again for a very interesting talk and great discussion.
Thank you. All right. But that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, let's do a photo. If there's no.
Oh, photo, yeah.
It didn't happen. No photo didn't happen. Claudia, please join.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Paul?
Or I